there, my name is Scott Larson. I am the creator, writer, and artist of the comic book series Visitations. Visitations is the history of Chicago as seen through the eyes of the residents of the city's oldest cemetery. For the past few months, I have been interviewing different people connected to comic books in one way or another, and they're usually people who are either involved in the making of comics or involved in cosplay or different fan items. And for today's installment of this, I am talking to Stella Bowman. And Stella has been doing podcasting for many, many years. She wasn't in on the ground floor, but she came in soon afterwards, and she started with the Spider-Man Crawl Space podcast back in 2007. Late 2007 was when she started, and she started her own podcast in 2009 called Batgirl to Oracle. And I thought that it would be nice to have her come and talk a little bit about how she got started and the types of steps she took in order to get going with podcasting, and also how she ended up getting different people to come on and talk to her. She's interviewed a number of different professional Batgirl creators, and I'll let her talk a little bit about that. Now, one of the things about Stella that really impresses me is we're all fans, but she is, she's a fan first and foremost. I'm friends with John Suntress, who does Word Balloon, but he actually started out as a broadcaster, and there are different podcasters who have done that, and I know a whole lot of different people who do podcasts, but I thought Stella was really, really interesting because she started out basically looking at message boards on websites, and then she joined an established podcast, and then she spun off on her own. And so I want her to talk a little bit about that. And I think she's a really neat person. I think you're going to as well. So I'm going to bring her on. And Stella, we can hear you, but we can't see you yet. There you are.
We're here now. Yay. Hello. What an introduction. Thank you so much, Scott.
Oh, sure. Well, it's like I said, I've always been really impressed by the stuff that you've done. And you're one of those people who focused on one aspect of the comic universe that you really, really, really liked. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I think that's really neat. But before we do that, I'm curious, what was the first thing you did involving comics? Did you see a TV show or a movie, or what got you interested?
Yeah, my first memory that's rather vivid with comics is actually pre-nap time rituals where, of course, no one wants to take a nap, as you know, I'm sure. But preschool age, you got to. So the way that my mother enticed me to take a nap is she would read these almost Fleer baseball card superhero cards. So, there'd be things like X-Men or Hulk versus the Thing. They'd have specific things, and then it would maybe tell the story of it on the back, or if it was an individual character, it would give specific height, weight, their power listings and things like that. And so that was really what got me started with it. But I'm very close with my brother, and he was big into the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I think I was just always aware of comics and superheroes, but it wasn't until I grew up that I really started reading them. And first it was always Spider-Man. Spider-Man was my go-to guy, which you and I are similar there. Mm-hmm. And in the beginning, it was just going through long boxes. And when I was younger, just looking for covers that I thought were pretty cool and picking them up and just reading that particular issue. But then I became a serious comic reader when Civil War was on the shelves, and also Infinite Crisis, and that's when I started seriously reading it. But yeah, it's been in my blood. But it's those little baseball cards, which I can't remember what they're called because Shag Matthews had found out what they were, and I was like, yes, that's exactly what they are. But that's my origin story. Those little baseball cards.
Was that like 94 or 95? 1994?
Yeah, it would have been in the 90s. Yep.
Yeah, I remember I was never, when I was a kid was when the Star Wars cards were out for the original stuff.
Okay.
And so my card collecting was a little bit different than yours. Ours came in little packs that you'd have to unwrap, and then there was like a piece of gum that was in there.
Oh yeah.
we actually here in Chicago we have a candy store that has some of that original stuff, and I think the gum is still there. And for gum that's 30 years old, it probably tastes exactly the same. I think that it was one of those things that didn't decompose. So that was the stuff that I grew up with. So you mentioned Civil War, and you mentioned Infinite Crisis. You like Spider-Man, but you do a podcast about Batgirl
I
and the
know.
DC universe. So what drew you towards and I'm going to make an assumption here, and you're free to correct me if I'm wrong, because both of those series were going on at the same time.
Hmm.
And it was kind of like this for people like me who had been reading comics and I was around during the first crisis. It was kind of like a renaissance where all of a sudden everything old was new again. It was really neat. But what made you gravitate in a certain direction with those stories? Because and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but in my mind you gravitated towards the DC stuff as opposed to the Marvel stuff, so you were more attracted to the Infinite Crisis. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think, and it depends on the era because I always feel myself going back and forth. It really depends on, I think, storytelling at the time and, do I feel, I don't know, happy with what I'm reading or not. And so it very much goes back and forth. But I think at that point in time, it probably was leaning towards DC. I was also going back and going on eBay and getting older stories, which at the time really wasn't, like Identity Crisis, which I absolutely loved, and things like that. And just really getting to know the characters. I wonder if it's because I was more aware of Marvel that it wasn't much of a deep dive for me to start in with Civil War. Both Infinite Crisis, I was really throwing myself into this huge pile of characters that I was like, who is Psycho Pirate? I have no idea. And so I really had to be intentional about, if I want to go on this comics journey, that I need to know who these characters are. And so really investing time and looking them up. And I think from that research is really like, oh yeah, I think, I very much like DC, but I never left Marvel. But I think it might have just been, it was harder. And so I had to put the work in. And because I put the work in, I appreciated DC more at the time, perhaps.
That's kind of cool. I've actually, on a little bit of a side note, I've spent quarantine going back from the end of the original Crisis, and I just finished Identity Crisis.
Oh,
I'm
wow.
kind of cramming it all. I'll be
Sure.
insane by the time this thing is over with. But so what stood out for you about that stuff? About those particular comics,
Yeah. Both DC and Marvel,
the
or
DC stuff.
just DC stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
Besides the fact that you had to work for it,
yeah.
there's certain characters that you liked.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah, I think it was the I felt like, I think you just mentioned Crisis on Infinite Earths, and I think mostly that is probably people's favorites. But I really liked Infinite Crisis. I think it drew me in a lot with character moments. And so just getting to know different people and seeing the effect of this particular crisis on them, seeing people die that were not unimportant people, and having that wash over, the waves, affect the rest of the universe, was really interesting to me. And yeah, that was when I started looking more closely into the, the Bat universe a bit more. I was
mhm.
aware of who Batman was, but getting to know these different people and like, oh, who is this Dick Grayson and Barbara Gordon? Because there's kind of some shipping going on there. And so getting to know them as well. So I think, mostly the character moments is what drew me to that story.
Okay. And I had another question about that, but it left my mind because I thought what you were saying was so interesting. So I'll go back to that, I'm sure, at one point. Oh, actually, I do remember, and again, this is a little bit of a side note. I remember talking to you via Facebook in 2009 when they brought Barry Allen back to life.
Mm,
And you talked about characters who had died during Infinite Crisis, and Barry had died during Crisis on Infinite Earths. And when they brought him back, I hated it, and I still don't like it. I still think he doesn't belong there anymore. But how did you feel when those deaths were reversed? Because I don't think there's anyone from Infinite
yeah.
Crisis who died who has not come
Who
back to
has
life.
not come back. Yeah. I think it probably depends on the character. I don't know if there's any one that I sort of rolled my eyes or was like, oh no, why have you done this? Um, Yeah, I remember, with Marvel, there was that whole rule about no one brings back Uncle Ben and no one brings back Bucky, but then they did bring back Bucky. And so if I feel like with comics, all bets are off. So I don't know if I was so invested in any particular characters at the time or, later necessarily, that I was disheartened that, why did this death not stay? So I guess maybe that makes me a weak fan. I don't know. But my girl hasn't died yet. So I'm okay. So until that happens and she gets brought back, I don't know. I'll wait to hold judgment on that.
So yeah, well, your girl went through a lot of changes
She
even
sure
while you've
did.
been doing the podcast. I can talk
Yeah.
to you about that in a minute.
Yeah.
So so how did you stumble across the internet?
Oh,
Because
the
yeah,
internet.
and I'm gonna say that, and I'm gonna say it like that because you were part of, you were part of that first generation that grew up with the internet,
Yeah.
where this stuff was more normal for you. And for example, Brad, who does the Spider-Man crawl space, is the same age as I am, and I know he started his site in '97 or something like that, and so he started doing stuff right away. But I didn't start to really find internet stuff and get deeply involved until probably around the time of Infinite Crisis. Excuse me, but you grew up with it to a certain degree.
Mm.
And it's kind of been part of your entire fan experience. And that's where you're doing your podcast from. You're doing it through the internet. So, how did that come about? When did you first get on the computer and start looking up comic books?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me, and it's funny because today I heard the dial tone and I thought,
Uh,
in the building that I was working in, I thought, where is this coming from? But yeah, I mean, the internet started off and I remember having to insert a CD-ROM, I think it was like Juno internet, and having the dial up and all of that for high school stuff and teachers starting to involve internet research a bit more. But it wasn't until college I think I started because there was just a necessity for that. And I have a classics major as well as an architecture major, a degree. And during architecture, you're on the computer so much because you're using CAD, you're using Rhino, you're doing all this stuff with design work that I was trying to find something to occupy my time. And oftentimes I would listen to music. Pandora was just starting out. But then I found this thing called like podcasts. I think I don't know how I found podcasts, but I went directly towards, Spider-Man podcast. And then of course the first thing I think probably popped up was Spider-Man Crawl Space. And so that was probably when it first started happening. And then, being more involved with subscriptions and checking on Marvel.com every day, and which was always better than DC Comics. I felt, I remember one year for Lent, for 40 days, I was like, I'm not doing anything comic related, which was hard, but I did it. So that just shows how much I guess I was on the internet looking at comics. But yeah,
mhm.
it all started in college, my second through fifth year.
And then just to back up a little bit, what was the first comic book you ever had that you
Oh
ever
boy.
got? And this is a two-part question. The first
Yeah.
one is, do you remember the first one that you got and the first one you bought?
Oh wow. Yeah. Man, I should know this. It's definitely a Spider-Man comic, and I feel like Hobgoblin was on the cover, but I really could not tell you what it was, and it would have been like 80s or something like that. Like I said, I just went for ones that intrigued me with their cover. First one that I bought. Wow. I don't know. Oh, yeah, because all of those are probably with my parents' money when we went. If I was a good child and we went to the comic book store, probably, maybe Civil War, maybe Infinite Crisis, one of those, like really starting off and putting out the money for those events, probably.
I'll tell you real quick my first ones. The first
Oh,
one I ever
please.
got from somebody was Batman number 258, which
Wow.
was a thick book, and it was him versus Two-Face, and I guess it was the first mention of Arkham Asylum. And the first one I ever bought was Detective number 319, where Batman and Robin battled Dr. No Face.
Oh, wow.
And it was before the oval went on the bat.
Mm-hmm.
And I still have both of those.
Wow.
I had gotten rid of my collection a few years ago, but I kept both of those. So I do have, I remember them, and I still have them. So what drew you said that you started listening to podcasts, and you had started, you'd listen to the Spider-Man one. Were you listening to other ones as well? Because I know around that time there was DC had a podcast of their own, and they would film, or they would film, they would audio. I was going to say tape, but no one calls it taping. Audio record different conventions, and so it was Crisis Intervention or something like that was the name of their podcast, and they'd like do it at San Diego and other places. Were you listening to that stuff as well?
I didn't. Your friend though, Suntress, I was definitely listening to his word balloon, his interviews with different people.
Mm-hmm.
So those would be, I think, my primary two that I can remember listening to: Spider-Man Crawl Space and Word Balloon.
And then how did you get started at the Crawl Space?
It's a story of manipulation, Scott. Are you sure we want to go down this dark hole? So yeah, with Crawl Space, after listening to, I don't know, a couple episodes maybe, I joined the message board, just kind of scoping it out. I had never really been on a message board before. And I think, I don't know how long it took me, but in the back of my mind, I thought, I think I could be on this podcast, which sounds ridiculous now, but this is true. And so I thought to myself, I could try to befriend one of the main people, one of the co-hosts. And so, and he knows this, all these people know this, but Kevin was my first go-to. Mm-hmm. I tried to, because there were DMs, they probably still have private messages, and he didn't really respond. I can't remember what he said or what I asked. It was some sort of inane thing. And I thought, well, that's a no-go. So then I went to Zach, and we struck up a friendship. And then I think I just kind of started being buddy-buddy with everybody. And then I was invited on, they used to have Skype chats way back when. They probably still do. And was hanging out with them. And I think they realized maybe I could add something besides being a female, but, more so because I was female. And so I came on maybe just for a trial period or just like a guest spot. And it ended up sticking. And unfortunately, though, I came on in a bad era of Spider-Man. I lasted for a while, but yeah, Brand New Day. I mean, I recommend going back to the beginning of Spider-Man's career and find your joy there, because Brand New Day was a bit rough, but it was fun. It was a great atmosphere, and I met people like some of the, like you and Josh and Don, like a lot of these people that I'm so friends with, I met through the Spider-Man Crawl Space, and it's really what launched me into my own podcast. So I don't regret that era at all, and I'm very appreciative to Brad and everyone on that show for giving me a shot.
It's really interesting. I think that there's a couple quick comments about that bad era, and I was not happy with that era at all. However, if you read that stuff separate from everything else, it's perfectly fine. But there's two different things, and I think one of them is when you're doing comics, every era is brand new for somebody, and so it becomes their favorite era.
Yeah.
And then the other thing, and I was talking about Star Trek this weekend with a group of people, and we were talking about Star Trek Discovery, and it was basically like, it's the worst show ever. And I'm like, well, are you ever going to stop watching? And they're like, no, never. And typical fans. And it's really interesting because I think that when you're a creator, you either tick people off or that you make them love you. But if you bore them, that's when they leave. And I think that even though there are a group of us that really hated that Brand New Day era, we all stuck around. And even if we vowed to leave, we all came back.
Yeah.
And I'm finding myself rebuying that stuff now. So it's not even that I bought it once, I'm buying it a second time. So, and I think that's part of it too. And that's part of the fan experience, to where you have to be really angry sometimes because they've screwed everything up. But if they bore you, that's the worst. And I think that's one of the things that happened in comics right before you got into it, which was why Infinite Crisis and Civil War were so exciting, because all of a sudden things were happening again. So that's my commentary. So when you were invited onto the podcast, I'm looking at you now and I can see your microphone. And now that I'm part of this new technological age, I don't even need one of those. But the new Zoom age. But you've got the microphone, you've got
Yeah.
the headphones, and everything else. Did you have to, when you first went on the crawl space, did you have to go out and like buy that stuff to make sure it worked, or did you just like sit on the phone?
Oh, no, there was. Oh, that's interesting. No, do remember having some Skype phone things, but that was for another podcast. So this is like my most recent purchase with tech, besides actually the camera. But no, it was just like a Logitech headset that I went out and got, which
And
I had to, I guess, for Skype anyways, because I wanted to be a part of these Skype chats with the Spider-Man Crawl Space crew. And so then I was like, oh, well, I'll go out and get this. So that was my first technological, which I don't actually recommend if we're talking about recommendations for podcasters. I think it's good for a startup, but if you want to be serious about it, there are just so many problems that I had with it, looking back, that I'm very happy with this purchase.
So I want to focus on something you said just a couple minutes ago, and I found it interesting, because of the other people I've interviewed in the different walks of the comic book world. Everyone's kind of done something similar. You mentioned about the manipulation of the crawl space guys, and I think that's one way to put it. But I think the other part about that was, excuse me, you looked at what they were doing and you wanted to be a part of it. And so you found a way to become a part of it. And so have you applied that in any other areas in your life? I mean, I know it sounds silly where it's like, oh, I got onto this podcast, but that's something that some of the artists that I talked to have done. The editor that I talked to did. Somebody who makes movies, and they're all kind of doing the same thing, to where it's like they're not quite following the rules and they're looking at different ways around that. And it's like, how can I personally make this a part of my life? And that was a decision that changed your life.
Yeah.
Because you're doing what you're doing now. Do you do that with other things as well?
How do I make something a part of my life? Yeah, I try not to make idols of things, certainly, but if I want to become a fan, or if there's something that I want to engage with, I don't do it half-heartedly. I'm a big fan of soccer, and so UVA is a university around here, and so that's something that I'm going to support this women's soccer team, and get season tickets and become a fan and really support them and know their names and things like that. So I don't really go in halvesies. I really like to dive in and do that. And I think to a certain extent, to be successful in anything, you have to do that. You can't just be on the periphery of what you're doing and, one toe in, one toe out. If you want to be involved and engaged in something, you really need to put yourself in there. And that's what I feel like. I've done, and it's changed. This podcast has changed me completely from who I was when I started in 2009. So I feel like it could be dangerous though, because you're putting your heart on the line to a certain extent, depending on what it is. You could get hurt, who knows? But I think sometimes that risk is worthwhile. Does that answer the question?
I think it does.
Okay.
So how long were you on the crawl space for?
Boy, I think at least 2011, maybe. I'm trying to think. Like, I remember where I was when I was starting to roll. So I feel like it was Spider Island was my last go. That was like the last story I did. I don't know if that was 2011 or 2012.
I'm thinking it had to have been 2011, because I think
Okay.
that the end of 2012 was when he switched minds with Dr. Octopus.
Yeah, I wasn't there for that, but I heard it was good.
It
Yeah,
was
so
good.
probably the fall of 2011, I think.
Okay, so you basically jumped on for Brand New Day and stuck around until that was over, and then you left.
Yeah, I stuck
Um,
it out. Yeah.
so what made you decide to do your own podcast after being on? Now you did
Yeah.
both of them at the same time too.
I did. Yeah, I did.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
So I think I had a shtick, which kind of has continued on my own show where I talked about literature, but I think it's been so long. I had like an English accent, I think, and talked about literature. It was like some alter ego that I had. I don't know. I still do alter egos, so don't worry, that much has not changed. But I jokingly thought, what if I started a podcast about literature, but didn't really think that would fly and was only half serious about it. And then over a summer, I had surgery on my foot and was laid up, obviously, because it's the foot. And I was really starting to investigate this Barbara Gordon character because I knew her as Batgirl from Batman the Animated Series. But I'm not sure what. Well, actually, I do know what it is. It was Batgirl Year One. At that time, I was just looking for graphic novels that I could read that were sort of one and dones that I could learn from. And I read that and immediately fell in love with that character. And from then on, I was just trying to find more information about Barbara Gordon. I was looking up fanfic. I was trying to find things about her and Dick Grayson, all these sorts of things. So then I thought, what if I created a podcast about Barbara Gordon? And this was still half serious, but it started actually percolating into something that was truly serious. And then it was just about asking questions. I already had the experience of podcasting, but not podcast producing. And so I reached out to different people like Michael Bailey, who would help me with, Skype. And I think at that time, I can't remember what the recording software was for Skype at the time. Um, and editing and things like that and tech. Do I need to have an update on tech and things like that? And I decided to go for it, and it was the perfect time because they had ended the Cassandra Cain run and her story was done, and so now there was this tease of who's this new Batgirl who has Cassandra's batsuit on, but maybe Cassandra may not be. And I thought this is the perfect time, and came up with the plotting, I guess, or the formatting. There's the word, the formatting of the old and the new and that, and started off and yeah, didn't look back. So my other suggestion would be to have a mentor, like a podcasting mentor that you can talk to and just ask questions about technology and how do you do this and get constructive feedback. If something doesn't seem right to you, send it their way. But yeah, so it started off as a joke. It was all a joke, which I guess is ironic because Batgirl started off as a joke too. Barbara Gordon getting her suit to play a prank on her father. And so, but look what happened. She ended up being in the costume and then Oracle. And look what happened to me 11 years later. And here I am with this podcast. So yeah, it's kind of a funny little journey, I guess.
So I think that's really neat. I think that's a really, really, really neat story. So you start your podcast, and it's 2009, and you have your first episode. What was that like?
Oh gosh, it was nerve-wracking just because, and over preparation, which I think is good, but now I just feel like I don't under prepare, but I'm so comfortable now that previously I wrote everything verbatim and it was reading, and then you have to really tailor your voice so that it doesn't seem like you are reading from this script. And now I just have little notes or just word cues and have to figure out what I meant when I wrote it at the time. So over preparation, and I was living in a house with like three other people. So my voice was, kind of low. So I wouldn't mess with anybody, and quick. I feel like if I went back, that it would be interesting because those episodes in the beginning were 20 minutes and now I can barely, get under 2 hours, which is frustrating sometimes. But I feel like my analysis has also grown over time. So looking back, perhaps if I went, I'd be interested to see how I would change my analysis. But yeah, scared. I mean, you're putting yourself out there. Like you are really bearing yourself because I wasn't going in. Like I said, I go in all the way on this. And so I'm putting my heart out there. I'm trying this thing. It's going to be on the internet for people to judge and listen to. I'm not out of college yet. So it's nerve wracking. And you also want to do justice to the character and the creative minds behind it as well. So there's just a lot going. So it's not, I feel like podcasting, people who are normies, I guess I could say, or who aren't really in the know might roll their eyes and be like, oh, that's easy, but it's really not. You've got, I mean, even what you're doing here, Scott, you are focusing on something that means something to you. You're asking questions, you're engaging with something, and you're also putting it out there to be viewed and judged by people. That's, yeah, that's scary. So that first episode, it was a scary episode, but here we are, nearly 200 episodes are under my belt. So it's worked out. But I've gotten my fair share of, negative feedback. So you've got to take the good with the bad. And sometimes I learn from, I like constructive criticism. If someone gives me something and they're like, this is how you could fix it, I'll absolutely do that. But if it's just like you're terrible and you shouldn't be on it, then that's something that I don't need to hear, and you also don't need to say it. But yeah, it's been worthwhile.
Um, so what was so there's all kinds of questions I have for this, and stuff I've never asked you, and I worry about asking because some of it might be like, oh, I don't want to relive that memory. But what was the response when you tried this on your own? I mean, do you remember? Were you like checking the numbers and doing that stuff, or were you just like, for example, when I do this, I put it out there. I don't even tell anyone when I'm live streaming it, and then I just don't look anymore. And so I don't look at the response. If somebody wants to send me a response via email, they're more than welcome to, but they don't have access for responses on YouTube, and I forget about it. I don't even think about it. So, but what was your reaction? I mean, well, obviously you had your friends who
Hmm.
I'm assuming you were listening to. What happened that first time when it was someone who never heard of you, where they're like, "Oh, there's someone new." What was that like?
Yeah, no, that was great. At the beginning, I was on Podomatic, I think. And so I felt like, just getting maybe 100 views or listens was great. And yeah, I feel like the vast majority were definitely my friends, but to have it and Podomatic warn me that I'm reaching the capacity of my bandwidth and that I had to keep upping it was great. And getting, yeah, emails from people that I didn't know, or perhaps they had known of me on the crawl space and had come over with me, was in fact, yeah, that was gratifying. I feel like those are the people, because the naysayers, besides, the person that you had mentioned, I think for the most part, they don't really go out of their way to say, if the avenue is a bit more difficult, like emailing or something like that. But it's the people who like it and take the time to reach out and say that they appreciate it are the ones that I certainly cherish. I don't know that I could necessarily say who was the first person, but my Zaius's radio hour, that was someone who reached out to me. Noctis was another person. So yeah, just people that came to me. So it was gratifying. Like, oh, it might not be the best quality that I'm producing, but at least I'm reaching people and they're enjoying what I'm putting out.
What was your most surprising comment? What was the most surprising feedback you got from somebody?
That's interesting. Uh, I don't know that I could. Hmm. I'm not sure if I had any. I'm so used to the people complaining about my lengths, which they do it as trolls, and these are people that I actually enjoy, but they do it purposely now that I'm just sort of used to it. But yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe any sort of surprise or accolades that I got some creators on there. Those might be good, but otherwise, I don't know that I could say.
I'm going to get to the creators in a second. I want to make one comment, and it's about reactions and
Mm,
how we tend to react differently to the way people sometimes want us to react. And I remember the first time I got a real negative reaction on my Facebook page, on my Facebook illustration page. The person like came up and started slamming my stuff, and I was like, I made it. Someone hates me. This is awesome. This is great. And then I found out it was like some crazy friend of my brother's. I'm like, oh, that sucks. I wanted it to
oh,
be a real person. Um, and I can remember the first convention I was at where I had done a comic with somebody in the late 90s. And it was like a 3-page thing. And I did it about my dad during World War II. And nobody knew of it. And it was just kind of in and out. And I was at Wizard World Chicago doing the table the first time I was doing the table. And someone came up looking for me
wow.
with the book in their hand. And I was like, really? And it was just kind of interesting. And
Yeah.
I think that those are the moments that as a creator of anything, you tend to remember, which is why I was asking, well, what do you remember the most? What
Yeah.
really um So you're working on the podcast, and you got a creator on. How did that come about?
Who? Yeah, so my first interview, which I actually recently talked to him, and I went back to our first interview and I realized, oh, you were my first one, was Brian Q. Miller, who was writing Stephanie Brown Batgirl at the time. And manipulation, I got it on by manipulation. So can't remember what site it was, but they had done a transcribed interview with Brian Q. Miller. And I emailed the interviewer of that and basically said, like, I have no malicious intent, or, I'm not up to no good. I have this podcast. Would you be able to send my email to Brian Q. Miller and see? And it's funny because when he emailed me, it had the quote that I said of, like, it wasn't, I can't remember what it was, but he had it in the subject line, which was a lot of fun. And yeah, so he reached out to me, which I'm so appreciative of, that he took that chance, and as well as the interviewer. And then we set up our first interview. But sometimes, yeah, it's reaching out and finding people. You'd think you could just Google someone's name and their email comes up, but I can understand why you don't want that to be
Mhm.
true. But, for people with innocent intents, you almost wish it were that easy. But yeah, that's just how I've done. And social media has helped to a certain extent, but the bigger the artist, I feel like they're getting tagged all the time with Twitter, so they don't really respond to you at all. And I'm having some trouble now trying to nail down something. So yeah, it's just reaching out, putting yourself out there. And the worst they can say is no. And that's not bad. I'm appreciating your work. And so I'm reaching out to you. Would you like to talk about it? And if they don't, they don't. And if they do, great. And I'll talk with them. So yeah, that's how I did it. Sounds easy, but
So, are you on Twitter?
I am on Twitter, yeah, at Batgirl the Oracle.
And then we'll talk about all your links.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I'm curious about that. So, have you gotten interviews from Twitter?
Interview requests, do you mean? Or
Yeah,
like
have
reaching
you
out to
actually
people?
like found a creator and been like, "Hey, I want to interview you,"
Yes,
and they,
yeah. Margaret Scott, who was the writer of Batgirl before the current writer Cecil Castellucci. I'm pretty sure Christy Marks was someone that I reached out to. Maybe Dwayne Straczynski, I'm not sure. But yeah, sometimes I'll just go on and I'll say, hey, are you interested in an interview? And tweet off to them. And it's funny because I did not have Twitter until I talked with Brian Q. Miller. And
uh-huh.
after the interview, he said, what's your Twitter handle so I can, pimp you out basically and like promote this. So then I had to go and create a Twitter just so this could happen. And yeah, that's how it all started. But yeah, so sometimes they do say yes. They do respond to someone, who has the intent of talking about their work with them.
So Brian Q. Miller was your first.
Yep.
And how far into your show were you when that happened?
I think that was episode 10. So nearing a year, maybe. I think we finished maybe with a year of Steph. I think it was like a year of her review. So I guess maybe it was a year in.
Mm-hmm. And then your second person was who?
I'm pretty sure my second one was Chuck Dixon and Scott Beatty.
You have them on together.
I did have them on together.
Okay.
Yes. And that was a Skype with 2 phone calls, which was interesting. Yeah. Before they got the Skype. Yeah. I'm pretty sure they were my next one, which was a huge get for me. Chuck Dixon, of course, is just like synonymous with all sorts of Batman, Robin, and all of that stuff. But I loved that I could talk with the creators of Batgirl Year One and gush over it. And they gave me a sizable amount of their time, because sometimes if you are interviewing someone, you've got PR red tape, and there had been later interviews where I only had like 20 to 30 minutes with them, and I had to send my interview afterwards once it was edited to the PR person to okay. But because this was past and they weren't, necessarily with DC, I maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours with them talking about Batgirl Year One. That was heavenly for sure to talk with those two.
And then have you reached out to other people? Denny O'Neil just passed away. Did you ever reach out to him?
I did not. No. One of my regrets actually was not being able to talk to Yvonne Craig. before she passed away. And actually, I had reached out to her publicist or something like that. And I can't remember what the response was at the time. I probably still actually have the email in my Gmail, but yeah, I think that was the one that I would have really liked. And yeah, sometimes they don't work out. I've emailed, or I think I attempted something with Alicia Silverstone. I think I might try again, but go through like really
Mhm.
particular routes with a publicist, because I love Batman and Robin. I don't
Okay.
know if she wants to talk about it, but I would love to talk with her about it. And I think Dina Meyer. So some of these like bigger starlets and actors, I think will be harder for me, but I would love to have them, because anything involving Batgirl is something that I
Yeah.
want to talk about and talk with them on my show.
What was the last thing she did?
Alicia Silverstone.
Yeah.
She is one of the moms in the 2020 Netflix Babysitters Club season 1. So she popped on there. I was like, there she is, Barbara Wilson.
Yeah.
Uh,
So let me ask you about that.
yeah,
I'm asking about all these fan things.
sure.
So tell me about your love of Batman and Robin.
Oh, it's the best movie ever. It's the best Batman film. What more can I say? It was probably the first Batman film that I had ever seen. I do recall when I was younger seeing the scene of Batman Returns where Catwoman like shoves the stuffed animals down the garbage disposal,
Uh-huh.
and as a child that was nightmarish for me. But the first full one that I watched was Batman and Robin. Rented it from Blockbuster, watched it multiple times. I think it was just a 2-day rental, multiple times. Just loved it. Chris O'Donnell, huge crush on him. And then yeah, adding a girl to the mix, loved it. And I loved the villain. I just think it's an amazing film.
Do you still go back and watch it?
I do still go back and watch it. Not as often, like on repeat that I do, but yeah, it's one that I could just put on and be like, oh, this is so great, that I'll never get tired of it.
Which, and that proves my point about Brand New Day.
Yeah.
Because there are people when Batman and Robin came out, and again I'm getting my fan on a little bit more than I usually do when I'm talking to people, but when that movie came out, I was so disappointed with Batman Forever that it kind of softened the blow to what Batman and Robin was. So I wasn't that upset about it, and that's one of those movies, and there are a number of movies like this. The Hulk, the Ang Lee Hulk movies like this,
Mm.
where sometimes I can watch it and really be like, yeah. And then other times it's like, God, this is boring. When is it? We're only 10 minutes in. Oh my God. And Batman and Robin is one of those films. I know there's silly, stupid things in there. And I think knowing that you can deal with it, but there were things in that film that I thought were fairly decent. Actually, my wife and I just watched all that whole run of Batman films, and that was watching all those. I was surprised at how much I enjoyed Batman Forever, and how with just a couple little tweaks, it could have been a really good movie. But it's not a favorite. That's my personal preference. But I like the first Keaton one. But so you've reached out. So who have you spoken with? You've spoken with, and I'm going to ask you for a list. And you talk about over prep. When
Yeah.
I started doing this, and I think you're like my 10th or 11th person I've interviewed. When I started, I prepared 2 weeks ahead of time. I had questions. I was sending them off. I wrote the questions like as I was like loading the video. So it's sorry, but I actually found that the interviews are more interesting when they kind of go off on tangents.
Mm.
So I'm curious, has it been all comic people, or has it been? Oh, okay, let me. Now I got a couple different questions because you interviewed me at Baltimore.
I sure did.
So yes, you did, and so I'm going to ask you a little bit about that, not about interviewing me,
How
but
was it to interview me, Scott Larson?
well, no, and I'm using that up as an example to where I'm going with this.
Mhm.
So you've interviewed people on your podcast. I remember when we met at Baltimore, you wanted to see Tom King,
Oh,
and
yeah.
you stood in line to talk to him.
Yes.
Now, and I know that your friend Josh has gone to conventions and interviewed
Mm.
like Joe Quesada and stuff. So when you've done your podcast, with the exception of me, have you interviewed other creators there on the show floor?
Yes, and
Okay.
that's all because of the batmanuniverse.net. So I was alone for a very long time with my own podcast, and then Dustin over at the Batman Universe reached out to me and asked if, I would like to join that particular family. And so I've been there for a long time. I don't know when it was that I joined, but then once New 52 started, I popped on to the podcast and became a regular member of that. And it was actually when I went to my first Comic Con, which I think was 2011. And I met Dustin there because Josh was working with Dustin at the time. And I ended up helping Dustin out with a couple interviews. So that was like the first time that I started doing it. I think Batman Year One had come out. So got to
Oh,
talk
the
to a
cartoon.
Starbuck, which was, I didn't recognize the importance of Starbuck now. I wish I could go back and interview her again. But yeah, so then subsequent years when I went to San Diego Comic Con, I was as press under the Batman universe. And so I had been interviewing a bunch of people. They're either comics or we would get into some video game things. That's where I saw Mark Hamill and TV shows and things like that. So yes is the answer to your
Okay.
question.
So how many in studio guests have you had, and how many show floor guests have you had?
Oh gosh. So in studio, I pulled up all my show notes because I keep them. I don't know. I'm seeing six.
That's a big number. I
Oh,
mean,
seven. Yeah. Oh, the creative team. Yeah, cool. Eight. I mean, I would say 8 to 10 if I kept. Oh, Ostrander. Yeah, there's nine. So about nine on there, and I think maybe I didn't include. There was a fan site that was doing Batgirl Spoiled, and I talked to that crew as well. And then with the floor, I mean, it sounds really bad. Like I don't want it to, but countless. I don't think there were so many, and sometimes it was so hard to get them, but oftentimes we would do round tables with TV and things
mhm.
like that. So where you sit and then ask some questions, and those are a lot during each segment. So a lot. I would not be able to count those.
When you go to conventions, do you get in on a press pass now?
Yeah, I haven't been to a convention for a couple years now. If I went back, I guess it would depend on what I wanted to do. But yes, I guess I would say yeah. So the previous years, I think I went to Comic Con maybe 6 or 7 times. I was going as press. I think the first press I went as Spider-Man Crawl Space actually for Brad, and then the subsequent times were all for Dustin under the Batman universe.
Okay. Which type of interview do you like better? The on the floor or the?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I do like so the on the floor ones, you have 10 minutes max, and then if they're behind, they'll cut you off and only give you like two questions or something. So it's really stressful. And I rely a lot on my memory work because I write down my questions and then memorize them and go in so I don't have to worry about it. So with the ones in my studio, I like them more just because I have longer. I feel like it's more intimate, just that it's one-on-one. I can really talk to them and investigate what they have been doing, and it leads for great opportunities of I do over prepare and ask lots of or write down all my questions, but perhaps they say something and then another question comes off the top of my head and we can do that where you don't have that much freedom, I think, on the floor as much. So definitely in studio would be my preference.
So so you talked to John Ostrander.
Mm,
And it's I'll tell you a story about him, and actually it's not really a story, but his niece worked for me when I was at Loyola, and I've got all these different connections to him, but I've never met him.
interesting.
And with the exception of Legends, and the odd issue of Suicide Squad here and there. I've never read his stuff either, and it's not that I don't have a preference for him at all.
Mm.
It just never popped up. But how long were you? How long was your interview with John?
Maybe an hour. I'd have to check my files on that. But yeah, we talked about, and this was post The Killing Joke because I had just done a special on The Killing Joke and we had a call-in show and all of that. And then just I wanted to talk to him. I actually, okay, if I remember correctly, he actually called into that show. So we talked with him for a bit on that. And then after a run of, I don't know if it was the full run or if it was a segment of Suicide Squad, because Oracle starts popping up in there a lot. I had him on and we had a fuller discussion on that and talked about Camille, of course. And I felt like he was the one that people were like super excited for, like, wow, you got John Ostrander. And I think until I started reading Oracle and in Suicide Squad, I didn't really recognize his importance, which is true, I guess, of anything. You don't recognize the importance until you're in there. But without him and his wife, Kim Yale, Barbara would not be around today, I'm pretty sure, because they took this bloody heap of a character after she was shot by the Joker. They didn't want DC didn't want anything to do with her. They took her and they created something brilliant that really reached out, resonated with fans, and such an important character. Perhaps, I know I'm biased, but perhaps one of the most important characters in DC, just because she's so interconnected with everyone and anyone can reach out to her and she can give information. So yeah, so that was great. It was a great lesson for me in learning when I was talking with him.
Sometimes these guys tend to pass under the radar.
Mm.
And I think as fans, unless you're really, really, really tuned in, you don't always understand the importance of who you're talking to, and their contributions to the different characters and the different universe. How do you think your show has changed over the years?
Whew.
Besides the fact that you start as 20 minutes and now you're like 5 hours, is it?
Oh, Scott, you did it to me. Yeah, so length certainly has changed. Technology has changed. How I speak has changed. It's less, I think, robotic and it's more fluid and it seems natural. Through the show, I've learned about different types of people that aren't, that don't have my similar background. So my mind has opened up to many different things, which has been great. I try to speak better. I try not to use filler words, though they do pop up, but hey, post-production, I can cut them all out. And I use it as a platform. It's a great way to, if there's something that I believe in, I can certainly use it. And now I try to keep political messages out of my podcast. And religion, I don't dive into it too much, but it'll pop up. But just, loving one another, which is something that anyone can certainly believe in, and advocating for different people. So using it as a platform, and it's changed me just being able to advocate for myself and be able to speak up, because I think when I started, I was rather reserved, and even in the workplace wouldn't really speak up for myself. But as I grew and became more comfortable, now I'm not someone who's going out and yelling like, I want this, I need this. But if there's a need, and if it can help me be a better teacher, which is, often where that would take place, then I'm going to advocate for myself for certain things. And yeah, of course, the storylines have changed. I feel like sometimes I become a grump, though I really try not to. But overall, I feel like I've kept mostly optimistic. That was my hope for the show, that even if I was reading unfortunate and bad stories, or stories that I didn't like, didn't resonate with me, that I wouldn't just be like, oh, this is garbage and be done with it, but actually have thoughtful analysis. And so I'm hoping that that is something that hasn't changed. And it was all about learning. With podcasting, I think it's got to be something that you're passionate about and you're willing to learn. And I was really willing to learn about Barbara Gordon, and I have, and then willing to learn about the technology as well. So I think, man, yeah, it's been great. It's been a great journey. It's tiring sometimes. Sometimes I don't want to record. Editing often takes twice as long as the actual recording. So yeah, if I have a 5-hour podcast, it's going to take me 10 hours to edit. But yeah, it's all been worth it. And I've put out an episode a month, and sometimes there are specials, and it's been great to get to know people that either have similar or different opinions from me, and talk with them or argue with them in jest. And I've made new friends along the way too. So yeah, I'm very blessed. This podcast as a whole has been very blessed.
Two questions, and actually one of them I wasn't going to ask, and it just popped in my head. Well, and it's interesting, and I'm curious as to what your take on this is.
Sure.
So you've been doing this podcast, and you've been doing it basically by yourself for 11 years,
Yeah.
which is really impressive. And I don't know how many other podcasts are out there that have been around that long. There's always a new one popping up.
Mm.
Have you ever had, or have you thought about like doing a co-host or like a partner or anything like that?
I don't think full time. I mean, as the years have gone on, I've had more co-hosts throughout the year than I did in the beginning. And sometimes there are pros and cons to it. The pros are I get them to share the burden with me, so I'll get them to recap some stuff and things like that. Cons is usually the runtime doubles, but it's my show. And so I think I'm not, well, maybe I'm a selfish person, but it's my baby and I don't really want to share ownership of that. And with sharing ownership, you have to share and I think discuss and have a mutual understanding of what the direction would be creatively. And all of a sudden, you've lost part of your
Right.
what your baby basically in raising it. So I just want to always have it. So these guests, they're great. It's great to have Donovan come on and talk about Cassandra
Uh-huh.
Cain all the time, but he goes off, I edit, and I edit how I want to edit and things like that. I format and plan out the episode how I want it to be, and that's how I like. So I like full creator control on my little baby, and I'm fine with that. So I think the answer is no. I
Okay.
don't want a full-time co-host.
So do you see yourself as a creator?
Hmm.
And so before you answer that question, let
Sure.
me move a little bit too. I mean, I mentioned this a couple times. You're a fan. You're a fan. You're a fan. And we are all fans, and that's
Sure.
true. It's you just are. But there's different aspects to comic books and different aspects to entertainment, and some of those aspects, you're going in and if you're like me, you're drawing comics, or you're writing them, or you're editing them, or you're making movies, or you're an actor, or you're doing this, or you're doing that. You're running a podcast and you're doing it on your own. What would be your take on creativity? Do
Yeah,
you
I think
consider
it's
yourself a
how I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Do you consider yourself a
Okay.
creator, and what would be your take on it?
Yeah. So I guess if I am a creator, there's a lot of plagiarism going on because of all the comics. But honestly, I feel like my audience might not have the comics that I'm talking about at their fingertips. Modern stuff, yes, especially like when I was doing Silver Age, probably not unless they had the showcase. And so it's my job to relay that information to them however I decide to do it. And so I feel like I'm using the comic as a base or as a foundation, but then I also am changing it. So I'm like a sculptor that's been given something and I'm going to change it in my own fashion. Perhaps, paying homage. I don't know if that works. And then give it to the masses. So I think to a certain extent, I am creating something that are a bunch of pieces that don't really fit together, but then I make them come together. And then creatively, it's just how I format the show. How do I organize it? What segments do I have? What sort of musical cues do I have? Like that's something that I love. What song really fits this particular issue? And then or sound effects, things like that. So I feel like yes, I am a creator, an artist. I'd have to think about that particular one. You didn't use that word, but I was just thinking, do I consider myself an artist? And then that's my creativity. Yeah, this podcast and how can I change it up? How can I make it fun? Something that I feel like this is worthwhile to put out to the internet. There have been few, I would say, episodes I've been dissatisfied with. One actually I just recently recorded. I don't know. I just fell off about it. But for the most part, yeah, I think I am creating something from a bunch of parts and giving due respect to the people who have written it or created it before me. So just coming off of them and using that as a model and creating something new.
So I've got one more question for you, and
Sure.
actually I'm going to give it to you in a couple of different parts because you just said something that made something else pop into my mind.
Okay.
Which is why you didn't get the questions ahead of time.
That's fine.
Um,
See,
so
actually, let me just say that if not like Stella from 10 years ago would have been exceptionally nervous to have done it in this format. But the Stella from now is like more confident, and comfortable, especially because I know you and we're friends and we've talked before that having this format works out. But just to say that I have grown, I would be not comfortable answering these in like hemming and hawing, but here we are. So it's all
I
worked out.
well, I don't know. You know what? It's really interesting, and I remember you from your first days on the crawl space, and I remember all those guys. And I haven't listened to that show in a while. Every once in a while, I'll pop in, but and and I was telling Suntress this where and I'm going off on a tangent here. I apologize, but I was talking to him on the phone, and he's like, "Oh, did you hear this episode?" And he did, and I'm like, John, I haven't because I'm not in the mood right now. And as a listener, there's times when I want to listen to this stuff, and there's times when I feel like I need to listen to music, or I need to listen to like personal growth stuff, or I need to listen to this, or I need to listen to that. And I said, and I'll go back to it, and then I'll listen to it all at once. And that's the way, as an audience we sometimes interact with the material that's out there. So even if you're putting something out now, someone might not find it for another year.
Yeah.
And I think that's okay. I think
Hmm.
that's the way it's supposed to be, because not everybody is in the mood right at that moment to
Yeah.
listen to Chuck Dixon. And then sometimes you're in like the Chuck Dixon moment where you got to hear him.
Yeah.
But and that's true. That's an actual truth on that. But do you have my first question is a two-part question. I'm going to ask you both parts, if you
Okay.
don't mind. Okay, the first one is what is your hope for going forward with the
Mm.
podcast? But then the other part of that is what are your plans for it? And those are two different questions, where it's
Yeah.
like, well, I can plan to try to talk to this person, or I can plan to do this, or I can plan to like go over this particular part of the Bat universe history, or I could do that. So what's your hope? Where do you want this to be in 10 years? You've been here for 11 years already, so
Yeah.
my assumption is you'll be here for another 10 years. And then what's your plans? What do you want to do with this? What's your
Yeah.
hope and what's your plan?
Oh, man, gosh. So when COVID started, I decided to actually use Zoom and try a new format. So I've moved on to the dual format of YouTube and the podcast. So the video goes up right away and it's unedited. And that's just if you want to see my goofy facial reactions, or I do screen share a lot, which is nice. So that has been fun, but I don't have a really nice studio, and it's, not like these people with these nice bulbs that come down and everything. So that's just for fun and probably temporary unless people really like it. Um, my hope, I, it doesn't seem like it, but I do want this podcast to end somehow. I have this huge Excel document and it's just all of these appearances. And I'm in 2001 right now of the vintage, and she's just everywhere. She's, in all these bat titles. And I just have to sift through it all, which is, I don't want to make it sound like sifting is hard or not a joy. It is, but what do you cover? What do you not cover? And so I would love for the show to end somehow. This is Barbara Gordon's journey. This is Stella signing off. I took you through, and like maybe the last episode is the first issue of that Stephanie Brown as Batgirl. That's kind of how I want to go out in the end. So I guess that's my hope and plan. Yeah, I guess also hope. I would love to have some of these actors on. Yeah, Dina Myers from the Birds of Prey, the short-lived Birds of Prey live action, Alicia Silverstone, Tara Strong, I would love to talk to. So reaching out, because those are hard. Those are hard to get. So that would be my hope. And then just plans, I think, is just to continue what I'm doing. I hope that, COVID is hard. Our nation is a bit of a wreck right now. I don't know what November's going to bring, but to be a joy to people or an escape perhaps, and that they learn something or have fun and enjoy themselves, that's a hope, but also continual plan. Like, I never want my podcast to be drudgery for someone to listen to, and maybe not relevant, or like this is harder to listen to than it is to live in our real life. So I think those would be, I guess. I hope I answer your question. Did I answer it?
Yeah, I think you answered my question just fine. A real quick comment, and I've been commenting more than
I enjoy it. This is like a conversation. I
yeah.
like it. I like it.
You were talking about sifting through all of this material,
Yeah.
and I remember. Now, my assumption is when you read Crisis, you read it in a trade paperback, the original. And I remember reading, I don't know if it was Crisis or Who's Who when they came out, because they both came out at the exact same time. And one of the text pieces, and I think it was Crisis. One of the text pieces said, they had hired Peter Sanderson to go back through DC's 50-year history. And he had to sit there and read every single comic book and make notes and make notes and make notes. So when they did Crisis and they did Who's Who, it was consistent. And they knew where they were going with it. And they couldn't start Crisis until they had all of his material. And I think the line that was put in the text piece was, he finished reading, immediately quit, and then went and joined Marvel. And it was just because he had so much material. And I remember reading that and I was like, oh, that's so cool. Because it's like, what a job that would be, to just sit down and read 50 years worth of comic books. It would probably damage your brain, actually. Now, but I remember, when you said you're sifting through this stuff, and I mentioned that I'm rereading all this DC stuff too. It's a journey.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, where is this person's appearance? Where do I stick this in?
Yeah.
It's like, where do I stick Green Lantern Rebirth in? Because it's coming. Do I read this with a Flash first, or do I do that? It's like, well, how do I do this? I don't want to be ahead in continuity and then be like, oh, now I got to go back. So it can be tough. So that's my commentary on that. So would you like to tell everybody, all two people who watch this?
No,
I'm kidding. Tell them where they can find you.
Absolutely. And let me just first thank you, Scott, for coming on, or having me on. Sorry. And it's just great. I've had a lot of fun just talking to you. I think that we had a conversation. It was great. Yeah. So primarily you can find me on Twitter at Batgirl the Oracle. And I have a Facebook page, Batgirl the Oracle. And you can email me if you have any insight, batgirltheoracle@gmail.com. So those are primarily, the places that you can reach me.
Okay, great. Do you have anything else to say?
I think, I just take a page from Shag Matthews' book and, find your joy, I would say, especially in these times, right? So if something's bogging you down and you're not having fun with it, and, comic wise, then go somewhere else and find something. So it's Spider-Man. Spider-Man was getting me down in the 2011s. And I decided, hey, I'm just going to start with ASM1 and go that way. And I have loved that. So I would say that if something, you don't have to read it if you don't want to. I am compelled to, because I have a podcast. But if you're just trying to, you find your joy. But if you have any questions about podcasting, certainly reach out to me. Like I said, find a mentor and just go in with everything, find something you're passionate about, and be open. That's huge. Just because if you're like, this is how I'm going to do it, I'm not going to change, that's problematic, because people could offer you advice. And if you're not willing to change, then your show might suffer. And also being open will help you learn about different things that you're dealing with as you record. So I think those would be my pieces of advice.
Great. And then for anyone who is interested, I am going to have a special Halloween show next week
Ooh.
where we're going to have a paranormal expert on. And Stella, I can give you the link to that if you want to watch it as it's going on. If anybody is interested in a free comic book, I do send out free PDFs of Visitations #1. All you'd have to do is email me at visitationscomicbook, all one word, at gmail.com. And there is a Patreon, but I haven't set it up right yet. So I'll talk about that later on. I'm sure you probably do a better job with your Patreon than I'm doing.
I don't even have a Patreon, so you're ahead of me on that.
Right off the bat. So thank you very much for everybody for watching. And